There is one man who has written and created more Transformers stuff than anyone in the universe, and that man is Bob Budiansky. Please give him a big round of applause.
Hello. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm going to be here to answer as many questions as I can that you might have. However, first, I'm going to give a little presentation so you get an idea of what my involvement was with the Transformers. And may answer a lot of your questions, and it might generate some new questions from you. So here we go. So here I am, Bob Budiansky. Next. And we're here for the Transformers. If you're here for My Little Pony or something else, you're in the wrong room. Next. All right, so it all began, well, it didn't really all begin with this, but it all began at Marvel Comics with this. So before Transformers became a Marvel comic book, obviously Hasbro Toys made a deal with a couple of Japanese toy companies to bring their toys to Hasbro and rebrand them as Transformers. And Hasbro then went to Marvel Comics, as they had a couple years earlier with G.I. Joe, and said to Marvel, we want you to do what you did for G.I. Joe. We want you to create a storyline and characters and comic books on this new property we have called the Transformers. So at that point, I was not anywhere involved. I had no knowledge of the Transformers, but the editor-in-chief at Marvel, Jim Shooter at that time, he was always the point man when an outside company like Hasbro came to Marvel and said, we want you to develop our property into a comic book. So Jim Shooter was the person who wrote the backstory or the treatment for the Transformers that Hasbro eventually approved. This is it. Okay, this is what Jim Shooter wrote. This is what everything is based on. This is page 1. This is a photocopy of my copy of it. Next, please. And you can see it says approved. So now we're on page, I'm not going to read it, but now we're on page 2. Again, more of the backstory of Transformers. Next. Page 3. Next. Page 4. Now you notice that there are some places, oops, better not knock this over. There are some places where things are crossed out. That's my handwriting. So as we were getting to the final stages of getting this treatment approved by Hasbro, by this point I was already involved with the Transformers, and Jim was telling me the changes that he wanted. So as you can see, if you remember the original story, the Transformers, the Autobot spaceship crash landed into a mountain, a volcano, which was originally Mount St. Helens, which is an actual volcano in Washington State that had just blown up back in the 1980s, somewhere around that time, early 1980s. So he had a change of heart. He renamed it Mount St. Hilary, so it would be fictional. And then originally he called the spaceship Anti. I don't know why he called it Anti, but he named it Anti, and I guess somebody said that name doesn't quite work for us. So he changed it to the Ark. So now it's the Ark. Next, please. And now we're on page 5. Next, please. And now we're on page 6. And now we're pretty much done with the treatment. So in 6 pages, Jim Shooter laid out the backstory of what was to become the Transformers. Then he went on to some of the characters. So you can see there was a human teenage character whose original name was Spike. And again, somebody at Hasbro must have said, we don't care for the name Spike, so Jim changed it to the name Buster. So I crossed out all the Spikes, became Buster. My understanding is somehow that did not get communicated to Sunbow Productions, so they went with Spike. But that was out of my hands. Next, please. And then we have a couple of the bios. So Optimus Prime and Prowl are names that were developed by another writer, not me. So originally, Jim Shooter hired a writer, a staff editor who had a lot of writing experience in comic books. He hired this editor to develop the characters. And for reasons that I don't understand, because I was really not involved in any of this yet, Jim didn't like most of what that writer turned in. And rather than go back to the writer and ask him to make changes, they kept 2 names, Optimus Prime and Prowl, and everything else Jim Shooter rejected. And he went looking for another writer. So I was an editor. I was a staff editor at the time at Marvel, but I didn't have a lot of writing credits. I was known mostly as an artist, an editor who could draw. So he went down editor's row, one office after another. He went to Larry Hama, who had done all the development on G.I. Joe. He went to a couple of other editors who had writing experience. And he said, I need you guys to take these 26 toys and develop them into characters, and I need it by next Monday. Okay? So by the time he got to me, it was the Wednesday or Thursday before the week of Thanksgiving in 1983. So as you might imagine, a lot of people are making plans to leave town and go home and visit their family out in Wisconsin or wherever. And he needed all 26 of these characters to have names and character profiles by the following Monday, right before Thanksgiving of that year. So finally, out of desperation, he came to me, said, Bob, you want to try this? I need it by Monday. Now, like I said, it's like on Wednesday or Thursday. So I said, sure, why not? I'm not doing anything this weekend. Next. So as you can see, here's a little bit of evidence of my hand on the work. Originally, there was a Decepticon jet called Ulktar. That was one of the names that the previous writer had turned in that got rejected by Jim Shooter. So that got changed by me to Starscream, which was acceptable. Okay. Next. So what I did was I took a yellow legal pad, and by this point I had been given all this reference material, which were the actual toys, because all the toys were just Japanese toys that already existed that were being rebranded, recolored by Hasbro. So I got a whole set of these toys, and I went through them one by one, and I would come up with names and came up with character profiles, and I wrote them on these yellow legal pads. So this one is for Optimus Prime. Now I didn't, like I said, I did not name Optimus Prime, but I wound up writing the profile for him. Next. And this one's for Megatron, which is a character I did name. And here's my profile, so it would be a profile, and then it would, I'd write down the function. I would give Hasbro alternate names because all these names had to be approved by Hasbro, which included being approved by the Hasbro legal department to make sure that name was available, that it wouldn't be intruding on somebody else's trademark or copyright. So Megatron was one of the names I came up with, probably the name I'm proudest of all the names I ever came up with. I think Megatron just has the right ring to it. And initially, Hasbro turned down that name. And I asked him, now, I understood going in that this was not a property that I had any ownership of, but I really liked Megatron. So I said, excuse me, before you reject it completely, could you tell me why you don't like the name? And the Hasbro executive that I was communicating with said, well, we think it sounds too scary. So I said, well, he is the leader of the bad guys. He is supposed to sound scary. And they hadn't thought of it that way before, apparently. So they said, oh, okay. Yeah, you're right. He should sound scary. We'll keep it. Okay, next. So and here's Starscream. Okay, so another bio. Next. And here's Ratchet, which was an ambulance. And Ratchet was a name that I came up with out of two ways. One was Ratchet is an actual tool, so it helps to fix mechanical devices. And there was a character from a very popular book and movie. The book came out maybe in the 1960s, and the movie came out in the 70s, called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And there was a Nurse Ratchet in that. She was not a good guy. She was the antagonist. She was the one that Jack Nicholson was tormented by the most in that movie. But anyway, I named it after that character and after the tool. Next. And here's another one. This one was Stalker, and Stalker didn't fly, so that became Ravage. And Ravage, frankly, is a much better name to my ears, so I'm thankful they turned that one down and I came up with Ravage instead. Next. And here's a jet fighter, which became Jetfire, I think. I think so. But anyway, that name was also turned down. Fireball. That got turned down too. I think that became Jetfire. Next. And Bumblebee. Bumblebee was originally Goldbug, and that got turned down. And Goldbug did come back into the storyline a couple years later as a different character. Next. And I took all of these bios, and for the purpose of the toy box, if anybody here is familiar with the back of the toy box, there's a little summary description of each character. So I took my longer description and made an abbreviated version of it, and there's the abbreviated version of it for Bumblebee. So you'll notice there are these things in the bottom here. Those are attributes. So strength, intelligence, speed, endurance, rank, courage, firepower, skills. So I suggested to Hasbro that they should all have tech specs. You know, we should know how strong one is compared to another one, or how fast one is compared to another one. We'd been doing that for Marvel characters. A couple years earlier, we started something called the Marvel Universe Handbook, which did basically the same thing. So I was just borrowing the idea for the Transformers. So they liked that idea. So you might be familiar with it from the back, because the backs had that really bizarre graph that you needed a piece of red cellophane to read the tech specs from. So that was, I did not come up with the idea of tormenting all of you with that piece of red cellophane. That was Hasbro's idea. But I did come up with the idea for the tech specs. Next. So here's my original chart, my handwritten piece of graph paper, where I took all the characters, all the Autobots and the Decepticons, and mapped out in a piece of graph paper their tech specs. And I presented it to Hasbro because they wanted me to show to put up what I was talking about so they could understand it. And once they saw that, they loved it. Next. And they made their own version of it. They just made it neater. Okay, so that's Hasbro's copying what I gave them and putting it into this form. And that's what they used for all the toy packaging that if you were collecting it back in the 80s, you know what I'm talking about. And you can see these are all the original names. Some of them are still being changed. Like you see, Sprint became Windcharger, Blowout became Cliff Jumper, Laserbeak became became Slazer, then back to Laserbeak. Hasbro changed its mind a couple times. Next. And here's one of the toy packages for Optimus Prime. Next. Next. And here's what I'm talking about. So those summaries went over here, and the tech specs went over here. Next. And then, lo and behold, who knew, Transformers became very successful. So Hasbro would come out with, as anybody who collected the toys back then, they would come out with another line of toys, and then another line of toys, and then another line of toys. Like it seemed like every 3 months, 6 months, or whatever, they were producing another line of toys. And so they would send me this list of their product listing. Here's the 1985 of what was going to be coming out the following year or the following half a year or whatever. And I would have to come up with all the new names and all new character profiles. So I continued doing that through 1989, through the first half of 1989. Next. And here's another product listing. Next. And you can see as I'm going through it, I'm filling in new names. Like you can see Motorized Playset became Fortress Maximus. And so on and so forth. Next. And by this point, Hasbro had run out of the Japanese toys to give me as reference material. So they would give me model sheets. So based on these model sheets, I'd be able to see what the characters look like, what they transformed into, and from that, I would be able to devise a name and a new character profile. Next. So you can see this guy transforms into this kind of lobster-like creature. Next. And he became Nordalator. Next. And here's the whole thing put together, you know, with the summary and the tech specs and all the different versions of the toy, and that would all be put together eventually for their packaging. Next. And here's another one. This became Snakeskin. It's a pretender figure. Next. And different parts of snakeskin. Next. And here we are. Issue number 1, which came out sometime in the summer of 1984 of Transformers. So again, I began working on it in November of 83, and then we started doing the comic book. Usually it takes about 5 or 6 months to do a comic book from beginning to when you could buy it. So this came out, it says September, but that usually means it was on sale like in July probably, 2 months before the 2 months before the sale date on the cover. So this is beautiful covers done by Bill Sienkiewicz, and I was the editor of the miniseries. So as you can see, we planned it as number 1 in a 4-issue limited series. Marvel had no faith in Transformers or any other property that would come into Marvel from an outside licensing company like Hasbro, where we were licensing, their property. We would give it a try, but we didn't have any faith that it would be successful. So we were only planning it as 4 issues. Next. But much to our surprise, it was a big success, and we continued it with issue 5, which is the first issue I started writing. So after the first 4 issues, I was no longer the editor of the book, I became the writer of the book. I stayed on as writer from 5 through 55. I missed about 3 issues in between. So I wrote 48 issues of the book. Next. And this is a typical plot. So I would write out a plot, which is like a short story, and once it's approved by the editor of the book and by Hasbro, it would go out to the artist. So here's the Transformers number 16, the smelting pool. Actually, this became number 17. So this is how I would start out a plot. Next. And there's the actual comic book that was based upon. So a plot would normally go for like 8 or 12 pages like I just showed you. And that would give the artist everything he or she needed to draw the book. And typically I would do the cover layouts. I wouldn't draw the covers myself, but I laid out this cover for another artist to draw. In this case, it was Herb Trimpe. So I would give him an idea of what I wanted the cover to look like. Next. After a while, I took a little bit more mercy on the artists. So I'd give them a list right on the top saying, here are all the Transformers you're going to have to draw this issue. So right away, they knew what they were getting into. They could pull all their reference materials together, and they would be ready to do it. And they would probably be silently cursing me under their breath. Next. And that became this issue, Decepticon Graffiti. This issue is special to me because it got a fan letter. I mean, every issue got fan letters, which was great. This issue got a real special fan letter from Stan Lee. He read the issue and sent us a fan letter, which was like no greater honor to get a positive Stan. I mean, luckily it was a fan letter that liked the story, but no greater honor than to get a fan letter from Stan Lee, which we printed a couple issues later. Next. And as I was saying, I used to lay out all the covers for the artists. Not all of them, but most of them. So here's an example. This is a cover layout I did. So I had an idea in my head for this particular story. This is about the Scraplets, which is like a virus, their version of COVID back in 1986 or whatever it was. It's like a virus that infected the Transformers. And I wanted the artist inside, who was doing the interior of the book, to understand what these Scraplets looked like. So not only did I do the cover sketch, so this might take me like 5 or 10 minutes. Next, I did the cover. I wanted to make sure he knew what they looked like. So whereas the cover sketch might take me 5 or 10 minutes, the cover might take me 5 or 10 hours to do the pencils to get it right. But I really like the way this cover came out. It's my favorite of the Transformer covers that I drew. Next. And again, here's another cover sketch that I provided for a different artist. And next. And that became this cover. This is drawn by Frank Springer. So, like I said, I did a lot of the cover sketches. Most of them went to other artists. Next. And here's yet one more cover sketch. And I had just visited the Grand Canyon, so I figured I'm going to put that into a story. Next. And in this case, I decided to draw it myself. This is another cover I drew. Next. And yet one more. I had just gone on vacation to the Caribbean. Luckily, I didn't see anything like that underwater, so I did the cover sketch. And next. And that's the cover I drew. Okay. So when I had the chance and when I had the desire, I would draw the cover. But usually I was too busy. I had a day job as an editor. I was writing the book. There was only so many things I could do at one time, so I only did a handful of covers. Next. And as we were talking about earlier, I did all those bios. They got all collected into this Transformers Universe book. Next. And then Transformers kept expanding its mythology. Hasbro would introduce the Triple Changers, the Pretenders, and the Headmasters, and I would have to find ways to integrate all these new ideas into the backstory and the mythology that already existed. Next. And so here's the treatment for the Headmasters, which became a mini-series on its own, which I wrote. Next. And here's the first issue of the Headmasters, which I also drew that cover. Next. And they asked me to write up, I had introduced this concept of the creation matrix, which was a way for new Transformers to be created, because originally we started with 26 Transformers, and Hasbro kept adding more Transformers, so I was trying to find different ways to introduce more and more Transformers into the storyline. So one of the ways I came up with was the creation matrix, which I think got translated into the Allspark in the TV and movies. They use I think it's basically the same idea, Allspark creation matrix. So I wrote that up for Hasbro. Next. And this is where my presentation at this part of it ends. So this just shows the creation matrix in use. In this case, Buster Witwicky has somehow gotten the power of the creation matrix inside of his head. So he's using it right in this panel. And that completes our PowerPoint. Thank you. So we have a little more time, and I'd be happy to answer your questions. I don't know if anybody's going to moderate this, or is it just up to me? I'm happy to call on people. Okay. You first. You step up, and I'll repeat the question. So, yeah.
When the movie was coming out, that was
Well,
when the movie was coming out, Hasbro was making the controversial change to like phase out the original characters and put in new characters. And what was your reaction to that? To having to do these new characters like Optimus Prime, Ultra Magnus, and I think you had to kill Optimus and Megatron off in one issue.
Okay, well, so good question. Like the movie came out, Hasbro had they pushed aside all the old characters. They were interested in introducing new characters like Galvatron and Optimus Prime, et cetera, et cetera. It didn't really affect me at all. I didn't use the movie characters in the comic book. I believe it affected the animated TV show, which I had nothing to do with. So the movie, from Marvel's point of view, from my point of view as the editor of the movie adaptation, was a one-shot. We did the movie adaptation, put it out there, we were done with it. I asked Hasbro before the movie, do I have to follow, but by the second season of the animated show, they moved in a different direction from the comic book and from the first season. So I asked Hasbro, do I have to follow what they're doing in the animated show? They said, no, continue what you're doing. But related to what you're saying is, yeah, but Hasbro kept coming out with another half a dozen characters every few months. I had to find ways to bring them into the comic book. So on my own, I pushed aside different characters. I temporarily killed off Optimus Prime. I had a huge battle around issue 50 or something where a whole bunch of characters got destroyed. But they had to make room to bring new characters on stage. And it's really hard to write a comic book if there's 100 characters in it. You just can't do it. You have to find ways to clear the stage. By the way, I named about 250 of those characters. So I wasn't going to feature them all in one issue of a comic book. Okay, next.
I have a microphone here for questions. So we got some questions. Some questions. Let's not have that happen again. We have a question over here.
Who came up with the idea of functions for the Transformers?
I didn't hear it.
Who came up with the idea of functions for the Transformers?
Functions?
Yeah.
what role they played? And I did. Yeah, I mean, that's just part of the bios that I was showing you.
Okay, we have 3 back here. 1, 2, 3.
When you were writing your characters, did you ever feel there was one that you wanted to do more with, or you saw maybe more used of that? I think a great example was, I know IDW did a lot with Thundercracker, Was there any one that you saw that was a lot that had a lot you could potentially have done with that maybe you didn't get a practical opportunity back in the 80s when you were doing the writing?
So which character would I like to have done more with? Well, as I just said, I always had to introduce new characters. So it really put a limit on how much I could use certain characters because I needed to come up with new storylines to introduce all these other characters. So I did. It was a very frustrating experience after a while, but I would be developing certain characters, and I would be getting into writing that character. Then I would have to shove them aside. So I think the one that stands out the most is a character Blaster, because of all the stories I wrote, some of my favorite stories involve Blaster, but it wasn't Blaster comics, it was Transformers comics, so I had to be a little bit more inclusive than just writing stories about Blaster. So eventually, he got pushed out of the way. I don't remember all the characters that I might have started getting into and then would have to ease out of the way, but I'm sure there were more than just Blaster, where I was initially writing some stories and developing a character that I liked and then had to put it aside.
Okay, another one over here.
Hi. When the book Transformers Exodus came out, were you ever consulted about the story behind Orion Pax or Megatronus?
First time I've ever heard of that book.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
So I had nothing to do with it. No.
All right, another one here.
Who was your personal favorite Transformer to write or draw?
My personal favorite to write or draw. So that's kind of like two questions. So I kind of just answered it. My personal favorite to write was Blaster, because some of my best stories centered around Blaster. My personal favorite to draw, I have no favorites to draw. I really dislike drawing Transformers. They're a lot of work. Now, if you come by my table, you'll see that I've done many Transformers illustrations. So, if forced to under death threat or whatever, I will draw Transformers, or if you pay me. But I don't have any favorites. Next.
Okay, over here.
Hi. Yeah, in my opinion, many of the best stories, or most of the best stories, came right out of the comics, the early comics. And I thank you greatly for that. Among my favorite stories and characters in the early days were about Shockwave and Ratchet. Shockwave, he was a Decepticon I could respect. I mean, he wiped the floor of Megatron, and Ratchet, the way you used him, he was part of one of the best underdog stories I've read or experienced. I thank you very much for that. So what were your inspirations for the use of those characters? And I love the fact that you actually drew from their cards on the back of the boxes, the information, and it seemed like they very much made their way into the stories.
Okay, so you're asking me what my inspiration was for how I used Shockwave and Ratchet in those stories.
Yeah.
Let me confess something. Since those stories I wrote were almost 40 years ago, I don't remember every reason I did this or that. Every story, plot movement, every little plot twist or whatever. I don't really remember those things. Sometimes I do, mostly I don't. Now with Ratchet, I think I put him into a situation where he was really an underdog. He was the survivor. The Transformers had all just gotten slaughtered, and he was out there, and he was a doctor. He wasn't really trained as a soldier as much as some of the other guys. So I like playing with that, taking somebody who you might least expect to rise to the occasion to help save the day. So I think that was part of my inspiration there, because I took somebody who you would not immediately think of as a hero and put him in a heroic situation where he had to rise to the occasion. Shockwave was just such a eerie-looking character. He really stood out. And I just wanted to have him come as much as the Transformers were aliens, I wanted Shockwave to come across as even more alien. Whatever, no pun intended, whatever spark of humanity you might detect in one of the Transformers, whether Decepticon or Autobot, you would find even less of it in Shockwave, because he just didn't look like us. So that's where I think I was coming from in writing Shockwave. Hope that answers your question. Sure.
2 questions. Bumblebee in the movie, he was originally a Volkswagen, and then he was converted into a Chevrolet for the film franchise. What role did you play in his development, and what influenced you? And also the second question, what is your method of writing? Because Larry Hama, he's like a freehand type of writer.
All right. Good questions. Okay, so Bumblebee turning from a Volkswagen into a Chevy, I had nothing to do with. I'm sure what determined with that was that General Motors offered Hasbro a lot of money to feature their Camaro or whatever it was in that movie, and Hasbro said, okay, as long as we can make it yellow, he could be Bumblebee. I'm just guessing. I think that's how things work in Hollywood. So that's number one. Number two is what's my method of writing? In the most general terms, I don't think I'm unique in this as a writer. I'm kind of a sponge. You know, whatever experiences I have, whatever I'm exposed to, whether it's TV news, magazine articles, reading the newspaper, a book I read, a movie I saw, they all entered into different aspects of my writing, where I would be inspired. I won't say I would copy, but where I would be inspired to come up with different ideas and different elements of the plots that I came up with. So generally, what I would do is, well, first of all, I looked at Transformers as basically a fish out of water story. So if you know what that means, it means like you take somebody who's one thing and you put them in a completely different environment. Fish out of water. In this case, the Transformers were the fish. They were these giant, powerful alien robots. They were on Earth. So I was always looking for situations to put them in that I felt I could relate to and my readers could relate to, but then put the Transformers there. So it could be a rock concert. It could be a vacation in the Caribbean. It could be going camping in the woods. And in all of these different situations, the Transformers would pop up for one reason or another. So that was the basis of what generated a lot of my stories. And then from there, I would try to come up with, well, I want like a really punchy ending. So I would often jump right to the ending. How am I going to twist this idea and come up with an ending that has impact? And then I would try to come up with like a big scene, so it's not just a bunch of guys talking back and forth to each other. So I came up with the fish out of water scenario. Then I would often jump to the ending, and then I would come up with like that big cataclysmic scene between whoever the antagonist and the protagonist was. It sounds a little formulaic, but that's just general. Every story had its own building blocks, put it that way, And I would, construct it in different ways. Each story would have its own history of how I came to make it. Yes.
So Bob, I have a question about a lot of the early Transformers had abilities. Some could turn invisible, some could teleport. Were you trying deliberately to make it more relatable for comic book readers by giving them kind of a superpower?
I don't know about. I just wanted. Well, I didn't want them to just go around just hitting each other, so I wanted to give them all unique abilities. And frankly, when you write 250 character bios, there's only so many abilities to go around. I probably repeated myself a few times. So I don't know. I mean, maybe there was something that about that particular design of that character that conveyed to me a sense of, well, this guy should teleport, or this guy should do this, or this guy should do that. I don't even remember what those abilities were. I would have to read through my bios, figure out what you're referring to. So, next. How are we doing on time? Okay.
So I got 2 questions, but I mean I know the answer to them, but I figured the audience would benefit from it. One was, normally the Decepticons are led by either a maniacal Megatron or Shockwave, but what was the reasoning for choosing a cassette Ratbat to be leader of the Decepticons? And also, what was the reasoning for the name of the character Boltax? So
wow.
those are questions that you've told me the answers.
This is like a ringer in the audience here. This is interesting. All right, so he's as if I planted these questions. So number one, Ratbat. So as I was just saying, frequently I would be inspired to come up with ideas from things I read. So back in the 80s, whatever, there were articles in the newspapers and magazines about Hollywood movie studios being taken over by accountants, people who were not creative, but people who just were bean counters, were just interested in the bottom line. So from that, I came up with the idea that I'm going to make Ratbat like an accountant. What is the purpose of the Decepticons on Earth? It's to like suck up all the energy and make themselves more powerful. So you could do it by brandishing your weapons and threatening everybody and stealing all the energy by conquering them or whatever. Or you could be an accountant like Ratbat and be a little more even-tempered about it and go about it in a different way. So that was my idea of Ratbat. We go from Megatron, who's this incredibly powerful, brutal leader, to Ratbat, who's quite different. So I like the contrast. So that was the inspiration behind Ratbat. For Boltax, so in one of my later issues, I came up with this mountain on this database mountain full of all this information on Cybertron called Boltax. I believe that was the connection to Boltax. Yeah, it was a database sort of thing. So it was a very powerful entity. Well, from college, I have a friend, my friend Janet Boltax. And as soon as I started writing Transformers, I always thought her name is perfect for some kind of Transformer-related element. I don't know what it would be. So I named this database entity Boltax after her. And she really appreciated it. And in fact, a few years ago, she said, I wish I had some comic books. She had 3 grown kids. She said, I wish I had some comic books, but I gave her one for her at the time. So she said, I wish I had one I could give to each one of my kids. So I said, I have extras. So I gave her the extras. We're still really good friends. She's one of my best friends. And next.
We have time for one more, so I will take money. No, wait, we'll go with this person over here. Excuse me.
Hi. When you would be writing, did you ever have any issues of following your own storylines? Because you've created so many characters. Did you ever have to have someone shadow after you wrote something to make sure it was still in line with how you described the characters?
All right, so the question is whether I had somebody who would look over my work and make sure I was consistent, basically, and I was following storylines I had started elsewhere. I wish I did, because over the years, occasionally I go on an internet Transformers site and somebody will say, well, Bob did this in this issue, and he did something which negated that in some other issue, which contradicted that or didn't follow through. I did the best I could, and I'm sure there were occasions where I missed a beat. That's actually the editor's job. The editor is supposed to be the person who's monitoring the book, making sure it's consistent. But frankly, the editor's relying on the writer, in this case me, to be consistent and to know what they're doing. And most of the time, I think I did know what I was doing, but nobody's perfect. So there you go.
Well, thank you so much, Bob, for the Transformers and for this panel. The father of Megatron, everybody.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. If you have more questions that I didn't answer, feel free to stop by my table, okay?
Hi, this is Gary Chalk, Optimus Prime. Please stay tuned to Fandom Spotlight. You can watch it online at any time.